Thank you for that extremely kind introduction. And a special thank you to the Association of the U.S. Army for having me back and for the opportunity to speak with you today. It is definitely inspiring to stand up here behind the great General Sullivan and General Carter Ham and have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we are doing. I also want to give a big thanks to the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute and specifically to Greg DeWitt. It's not so new director anymore, but we work very, very closely with PKSOI. I don't know what we would do without them. They are an incredible asset in this space, both on the peace operations side and on the stability operations side, and we very much value their partnership and what they contribute to this field. You have two great panels that are going to be with you today, and I'm going to try to do them some justice with my opening remarks, recognizing that I am speaking to this group, a group of very dedicated and knowledgeable individuals about peace and stability operations. What Greg did not mention, because he's being very diplomatic, is that I am going to be going into semi-retirement, I guess I would say, at the end of the week. So as I prepared my remarks for today, I did so in the frame of what do I want to leave you all with as I leave my current position, and what do I really want to see conveyed as we turn the corner to a new administration. So let me start with the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are as a department at a policy level in terms of understanding and addressing stability and peace operations. Offer just a few observations, which I know will be well amplified by the two panels on where we are with respect to the status of peace and stability operations at the strategic level, and a few recommendations at the end. So where are we? We are at a moment of challenge, and I'm going to address both peace and stability operations. And I'm doing that really because I'm going to start with peace operations because I've just come off a trip with the Secretary of Defense in London at a peacekeeping ministerial last week. And as he said in his speech at the ministerial, the security environment, like so much else in our lives, is rapidly changing. While the world overall has become more prosperous and dynamic and has produced many opportunities, all this change, economic, political, military, social, and technological, has created challenges and crises as well. And he reminded in the front end of his speech where the Defense Department is focused, which I will repeat for you here, these 5 major evolving challenges. Taking a strong and balanced approach to deterring Russian aggression while leaving the door open to working with Russia where our interests align. Building a principled and inclusive security network in the Asia-Pacific region. Strengthening our deterrent and defense forces in the face of North Korea's provocations. Checking Iranian aggression in the Gulf. And continuing to counter and defeat terrorism, in particular, accelerating the defeat of ISIL. So as Secretary Carter noted, the challenge posed by ISIL demonstrates well how local insurrections can grow into global threats. The factors of instability, of course, are well known to this group and were introduced so well by General Sullivan. Threats and violence from violent extremist organizations, civil unrest, fighting between and among ethnic groups. There's a long list. They cost the lives of innocent civilians, threaten the stability of states, and sometimes bring about state failure. So even while the department is focused on these 5 core challenges, we know in this room how important it is to address the challenge of bringing peace and stability in fragile nations. In both pre- and post-conflict phases, one can see more than ever the importance both of peace operations and of effective stabilization strategies and operations. They are needed more than ever for the purposes of preventing conflict and for ensuring that conflict does not reignite where it has ended, to help make peace lasting. Therein lies the opportunity for positive change to address these challenges, and it's an opportunity that we really should not miss to make both types of these operations, our work in peace operations and in stabilization operations, successful. Since I just came back from London, I'm going to start with peace operations. It was really an unprecedented gathering of defense ministers and representatives of defense ministries. And I was particularly struck by how remarkable it is, given that, as was just described, there have been efforts over the past decade plus to eliminate any type of an organization with the word peace in it from the U.S. Army. Now, of course, well supported by the department. But back to the ministerial. Building on the momentum of last year's Peace Operations Summit, which President Obama convened, 80 countries were gathered in London, 80 defense ministries, of which something like 40 were represented at the Minister of Defense level. It marks the first time defense leaders have gathered to discuss how to improve peace operations. Surpassing expectations, 27 countries pledged new contributions to UN peace operations, additional to those who had pledged at last year's UN Leaders Summit. And in addition to the pledges, this was interesting, the ministerial focused on peacekeeping performance and accountability, sexual exploitation and abuse, a problem that is risks undermining the credibility of these operations in a significant way, increasing the number of women serving as peacekeepers to enhance operational effectiveness, and building a rapid deployment capability. And then demonstrating the commitment to strengthening these operations, there were announcements of follow-on meetings. So the French are going to host a high-level meeting at the end of October to address operations in Francophone Africa, and the Canadian Minister of Defense committed to host a high-level meeting in 2017. The pledges last year and this year are designed to fill important enabler gaps, such as lift, medical, engineering, and more, and to provide, more generally, to provide UN headquarters greater options among troop contributing countries, thus allowing the real possibility of replacing underperforming troops with those who are better prepared. The Department of Defense is contributing more to peacekeeping as well, drawing on our high-quality officers, our expertise developed over the last 15 years of conflict, our strategic lift, our logistics, our technology refined for use in austere environments. And you will hear more about that later today on the peacekeeping panel. You know, peacekeeping has changed so much over the last 20 years, with 98% of peacekeepers now operating under Chapter 7 mandates, often starting out in ongoing conflict with physical environments that are harsh, places like Mali and South Sudan and the Central African Republic, and in some operations facing a growing terrorist threat, that would be Mali. All the missions are mandated to protect civilians. These are nearly $8 billion operations annually at an all-time high of complexity and risk. So the opportunity for these operations is in the momentum behind the attention to the need for improvement to make them successful. The Leaders Summit last year, a defense ministerial this year, an independent review panel commissioned by the Secretary General of the UN. As Secretary Carter said last week, with new contributions from each of our nations and much needed reforms, we can responsibly share the growing peacekeeping burden at a time of global change. I hope that you'll have a robust opportunity to discuss this, where we are on peacekeeping in more detail this afternoon, but I would just say, coming off of this ministerial in particular, just underscored for me how important it is to seize the moment that we're in to make the changes that are necessary. Now on stabilization. Stabilization, as we've already heard this morning, but I'll say it again, is as important and certainly more complex than ever. And it's pretty clear that our stabilization efforts have not ended with combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nigeria, Lebanon, Ukraine, and other places, we are conducting stabilization operations in highly complex environments. Our current policy review definitely acknowledges that we have to preserve expandable capability to conduct large-scale, long-duration stabilization efforts in Phase 4. But it also recognizes that the department must better optimize our support to stabilization efforts in fragile or conflict-affected states, where the department is more often in support of other agencies. I would say, and it's been said already in the introduction, that a majority of our stabilization effort right now is in that space, and maybe will continue to be in that space for the foreseeable future. So from the policy perspective, we're doing an internal stock taking and stepping out to refine our policy. And let me review where we are with all of you. We've learned a lot from our 15 years of experience in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but we've got to translate those lessons into our operations, our complex operations, our small footprint operations in places like those that I've mentioned, and in Syria and Iraq. And since I'm leaving, I can say this, we are at serious risk of making the same mistakes all over again. I think we have to be honest about our collective stabilization hangover that has created a reluctance to say the word in some places, the lack of a real interagency focus for steady state planning around stabilization, some of the authorities that we had in place that are gone. And if you walk around the department, you would hear from folks that we're just not going to, the Department of Defense is just not going to be involved in these operations anymore. Nothing, of course, could be further from the truth because we are involved with them as we speak. It is just that stability operations have become so synonymous with Iraq and Afghanistan that we risk taking our eye off the ball on what we're doing today. So against this backdrop, what are we doing at the policy level to update all of you? We're rewriting our policy on stabilization. It's out for coordination, and we're undertaking a biennial stabilization assessment. On the policy, we are infusing, it's in draft, but we are infusing the policy with new concepts that emphasize what we call defense support to stabilization. And that's an approach that synchronizes defense activities to enable, support, or reinforce civilian stabilization efforts in designated fragile and conflict-affected areas outside the United States. The policy will retain the concepts that it carries forward with it, defense stabilization and transition when we're in the lead, but we are seeking to integrate this new concept, which we think will better take into account where we are today and where we need to be in the future. Our biennial assessment has 3 components, and we have some folks here today who are helping us on the biennial assessment, so thank you. The Army is doing an assessment of joint proponency. Can it effectively execute its assigned tasks? Our combatant commands are looking at stabilization challenges and whether the department is providing the resources, talent, and processes necessary to support combatant command requirements. And we're also taking a very close examination of DoD's roles and responsibilities and what should be the core stabilization tasks, tertiary tasks, and tasks to be eliminated. And we have some helpful support from RAND on that front. The recommendations out of the study should address responsibilities of the joint proponent, potential .mil-PF changes to fulfill joint proponent requirements, and departmental solutions for enhancing joint interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational collaboration and oversight. So we too are at an inflection point, and we think we're at a very important place. I think the study that's come out this morning, as it was announced, will also help to influence the work that we're doing internal to the department. So a couple of observations, if I might. Fragile states and transregional threats make our partnerships imperative. I think this is common both to peace operations and to stability operations. Fragile states and regions have critical impacts on our national security interests. We will only effectively address these challenges in partnership, international, interagency, and, as has already been mentioned, non-governmental. There is an opportunity now to think about these partnerships in more creative ways. We have lots of individuals who are extremely experienced, who have been through the arc of operations that can inform how we can be more creative going forward. And the department really needs to continue to ask, how can we best support our partners, our foreign military partners, our interagency partners, other international non-governmental organization partners? The second observation is on budgetary and resource constraints, which really require a special focus in the way that we play, the way that we support peace and stabilization efforts. And by we, I mean the Department of Defense. We have to be, as a government, strategic and selective, of course, in where we apply our resources and how we do it. And that is even more so for the department. I would like to put out there that I think it might be somewhat of a false narrative that given resource constraints, we have to make choices, an either or, a choice in favor of the kinetic or the readiness or the major challenges that I spoke about, or stabilization. We need both. And if we are to succeed in today's complex environments, we don't want to see more headlines, as we saw in the New York Times last spring that read, "Battle gains, no stability." And I think there is a way forward on both of these fronts. Now, finally, a few recommendations, which I'll make from a policy perspective going forward. There are a number of areas that are being worked that are maybe more service-specific or more department-specific from the Army's point of view, like training and education, which remains so vitally important, exercising. But I'd like to just mention 3 points that speak perhaps more, most directly to my current position. One is organizing the U.S. government effectively for peace and stabilization efforts. The second is DoD's roles and responsibilities. And the third is the funding and authorities question for these operations. On organization, if we want to succeed as a government in stabilization operations, we need to be organized well. It's messy, it's complex, and organizing in Washington in particular remains an uphill battle. I've seen this over the past 2.5 years. We do have interagency processes that address aspects of stabilization. We have a Fragile States Interagency Policy Committee. We have many, many meetings at the Deputies Committee and at the Principals Committee level that address regional issues, sometimes, maybe often, in some meetings more than others, talking about stabilization strategies. But what we don't have is a dedicated effort on stabilization. We do not have still a dedicated planning effort that can help these other groups, these other meetings at the Washington level to plan, to look ahead, to understand what resources we have to bear in stabilization contexts. We have a great partner in state CSO. We have another great partner from the department side and USAID with tools and resources. But the interagency connectivity, despite our collegiality, is still not as mature as it should be. At the combatant command level, no one really owns stabilization as stabilization. At the embassy level, I think teams work, as we all know, pretty well together across a wide range of issue sets. But there, they tend to focus on where the work is really more on steady state security cooperation And while we have very, very talented staff at the embassy level, there isn't necessarily an intimate knowledge of stabilization-related issues, and there's just a bandwidth challenge there as well. So the complex environments that we're now facing, I think, require more adaptive organizational structures going forward. We need adaptive authorities, and we need these adaptive organizational structures to help us apply these authorities in a more comprehensive way. Now, the chairman's recent irregular warfare assessment recommended developing interagency templates that could be used when organizing to address various problems. I think this is an idea, this is the type of idea that we should be exploring in the context of stabilization. Another area where we might look to examine as a model is the United Kingdom, and they've established, organized, and funded a 3D stabilization unit to more comprehensively address these multifaceted challenges. And when we left London, they told us that as of this week, they are making a similar kind of adjustment to address peace operations as well. We need to be thinking about these organizational questions, and I think as we round the bend to a change of administration, this is a great time to do that. Secondly, we really need to do whatever we can to clarify DoD roles and responsibilities. Stability operations are no longer tied exclusively to large-scale operations or to disaster response. Phase 4 doesn't necessarily follow Phase 3 anymore. Let's just take an example. We're facing, in a conflict in Syria, the question of the liberated areas. Whose role is it to stabilize? How should the military support these efforts? These are very real questions that we're grappling with right now, and the very lack of clarity around answers to these questions. So the department, in our view, really needs to be ready both to lead and to support, and in that to understand our roles and responsibilities in both different types of scenarios. And that definition of roles and responsibilities really needs to be defined early. We have good experience with this sort of definition, and it's in the humanitarian assistance and disaster response area. And those of you who have experienced with me in that particular area know that it's well understood what is the role of the Department of Defense. We are in support of USAID. We train, we exercise that way. And it would be terrific if we could bring the same kind of clarity and definition to the stabilization world for the purposes of coordination, for the purposes of communication. And then finally, an area, again, drawing on my own experience from humanitarian assistance and disaster response that really deserves focus, is defining the desired end state from the beginning. Through hard work and trial and error, we have made a lot of headway in the disaster response area, and I think this is it's a lesson that's been well articulated in this community for stabilization activities out of Iraq and Afghanistan. I just think it really bears repeating. And then finally, I think even where the department may not necessarily be in the lead, we absolutely have a responsibility to share within the interagency our views, our expertise, our capabilities to plan liberally and often, even where those are unsolicited. It may not be our lead, but if we have something to bring to the table, we really need to bring it to the table. And then finally, the funding and authorities question, which remains a perennial challenge for the department, particularly in the area of stability operations or stabilization, the question of whether we need a standalone authority, one that would require congressional approval. And I don't have a particular answer for you on this topic, but it is one that we are looking at on a regular basis. And if we could develop such an authority in cooperation and coordination with our USAID and State Department partners, I think it would be an added buttress to synchronizing our organization's efforts in the event of crises, in the event of our need to respond quickly to those crises. In the meantime, we'll do what we can to creatively cobble together the disparate resources and authorities that we have as best we can. Those are 3 ideas. There are many more. And I know that even though I'm leaving my position at the end of the week, I hope that I will have the opportunity after today to continue to work with all of you on this important set of efforts, really important set of efforts going forward. It's been an honor to serve and work with you over the past 2.5 years, and I urge all of you in this room to continue the important work in these areas, even when it seems that our institutions may be mostly looking elsewhere. I think this work does pay dividends, whether in stemming the spread of violence, maintaining a hard-won peace, or what we all strive for, preventing conflict from erupting altogether. So thank you very much.